Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode number 2585 of The Tom Woods Show, and we're joined once again by a man who is increasingly becoming a favorite guest on this program, and that is the great Dan McCarthy. You know Dan as a syndicated columnist. I read him in the New York Post on a regular basis. He is vice president of the Collegiate Network at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where he's also editor of Modern Age, which you should check out at modernagejournal.com. If you find Dan interesting, then why not go right to the source? Check out modernagejournal.com. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom.
All right. I didn't even tell you what tonight was about. Well, okay, so we're recording in the evening. The cat's out of the bag. I didn't even tell you what this was going to be about, but you are the kind of person who can just, I wouldn't say roll with the punches because you're not getting punched, but you know, you can basically deal with whatever's thrown at you. So I want to talk a little bit about some big picture topics that you know more about than I do because you're in that world much more than I am. And I'm talking about the world of conservatism. Now, obviously, the Republican Party and conservatism have had a relationship, an uneasy relationship, but a relationship all the same for a long time. And sometimes, or well, probably more than sometimes, one side of those two is frustrated with the other. But what I want to ask you about is, because of the rise of Trump in the political sphere, there's also been an evolution, I would say, of the conservative movement in the intellectual sphere, that politics does spill over into the institutions of conservatism and into the way of thinking, let's say, or at least the ideas that are given particular emphasis. So I'd like to start there, if we may. If you were to look back at, let's say, the conservative world of 2015 and compare it with the conservative world of 2024, where has it gone? Maybe either or both institutionally and intellectually during that time?
Well, in 2015, there was still a reluctance to give up on the dreams of the George W. Bush era. And so a lot of mainstream conservative institutions, they were slightly correcting course after the global war on terror, the overextension of U.S. foreign policy, but not that much. They were still, invested in this idea of the United States as a world policeman. Not only that, but also they thought that the year 2015 was very much like the year 1999. They thought the U.S. was at the zenith of its power and that they could actually afford to do, interventions in Syria, confrontations with Russia, all kinds of, worldwide conflicts. So that element of the GOP in 2015 was much more similar to what it was maybe in the year 2000 or in 2003 than what it is today. Economically, the GOP was still of, the impression that it could pretend to be the party of Ronald Reagan, pretend to be the party of kind of limited government and free markets, when in fact, Republicans did keep taxes low for the most part, relatively speaking, but they didn't do much of anything really, certainly not during the George W. Bush years, to actually scale back government. On the contrary, they actually really expanded government, whether it was Medicare Part D or whether it was things like the TSA and these new agencies that were created in response to the war on terror. So in 2015, conservatives hadn't really rethought that. What they were doing instead was thinking about this thing called it's so out of fashion now that I'm even drawing a blank on its name. Reform conservatism was what this was called. Reform conservatism was meant to be a kind of more middle-class oriented conservatism. But what that meant in practice was it was going to give you sort of the more big government components of George W. Bush, maybe with wage subsidies and other things. That was a, sort of policy wonk brainstorm of, a decade or more ago. But it was going to jettison even more of the free market material than George W. Bush had done. So interestingly enough, that reform conservatism wasn't any kind of, it wasn't trade skepticism. It wasn't anti-globalist. It didn't look anything like the Trump agenda. But it also was very much, departing from the Reagan agenda of, 30 years before that. And then, in terms of immigration, Republicans and conservatives as a whole, conservatives were, somewhat critical of mass immigration. They still thought, you had to work out compromises with, open borders Republicans, or at least, large scale immigration supporting Republicans. And so there was really not a lot of passion on that issue among the conservative, institutions and magazines and think tanks. And of course, all of that has changed. Now there is this real sense of a kind of pressing nationalism. There's a real sense that conservatism and is the right, and that the right is against the left, and there is this kind of conflict in politics. Whereas in 2015 there was much more of a sense of, can we be more efficient, sort of landlords of a common sort of welfare, warfare, but semi-free market America that's also kind of gradually socially progressive. But conservatives back in 2015 would have said, well, let's slow down that social progressivism a little bit, but ultimately we can accept gay marriage and everything else. Whereas now, I think you're certainly seeing on the right a kind of mix of extremes. On the one hand, there are people who say, we should jettison the social issues entirely. And then on the other hand, there are people who say, actually, this is the opportunity to kind of go and double down on those social issues. And they point to things like the success of the ads that were run against transgenderism during the 2024 campaign. So you've had this kind of dissolution of the middle. And I think that's true both among conservatives and also on the left. And instead, you've had kind of more mutations develop that are either going in a more statist direction or a more, maybe an idiosyncratic one, but an idiosyncratically libertarian direction. It's really much more of a kind of Wild West environment.
I think it's interesting that, unless I missed it, the retirement of Mitt Romney was more or less unmourned. I feel like there's something symbolic in the absence of Mitt Romney. Not that we don't have other, there'll always, Mitt Romney you'll always have with you, I suppose, in some form or another. But it's, the question that I asked 8 years ago, I think the answer is starting to take shape. What would become of the, and again, I realize that the conservative movement is something separate from the Republican Party. But as I say, but again, they obviously have been intertwined and they do influence each other. What's going to happen after Trump leaves office? Is the party just going to revert to Mitt Romney? And
no, I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, see, when I asked this of Paul Gottfried back in 2018, and he said, yeah, that'll probably happen. But I think if I asked him now, he would say, well, I think I was wrong.
He might say that. Yeah, I'd be curious as to Paul's response to it. As you say, Mitt Romney's not only retired, but he's an old man. And so, of course, is Mitch McConnell. There are some senators who are still kind of following the Mitch McConnell trajectory who are somewhat younger than that. But if you look at, all the Republican energy, young people in the Senate, and there are some relatively young people in the Senate, people in their 40s and younger even. And if you look at, J.D. Vance, all of the young talent on the, in the Republican Party and also more generally on the right is, it's certainly post-Romney in terms of its mindset. Now, where it's going is a kind of different matter. And I think a lot of folks, they have kind of, they imagine a path for themselves, but they haven't been around long enough to actually test whether that path is going to be realistic. So, part of what I wonder is, will conservatives have to rediscover lessons that they learned in the 1970s and the 1980s, especially with respect to what government policy can actually accomplish? Or is it the case that, conservatives are now going to be, chastened? They're not going to try to rebuild the welfare state or anything, but they're still going to try to be, instead of having a kind of one-size-fits-all policy economically, they're going to try to be more targeted and say, here's what you need for families, here's what you need for entrepreneurs, here's what you need for workers. And that seems to be the way we're going. And in fact, it kind of matches the general trend of American culture over the last 30 years, which is towards a kind of fragmentation. It used to be, 30 years ago, there was, one kind of rock and roll, and you had to be a real specialist to know what the other, versions of it was. And, there would be this thing called alternative rock or whatever, which was just this massive bucket into which all sorts of things were placed. Whereas now people on Spotify and, on all the other apps, they can listen to some very carefully curated and, sort of hyper niche, hyper specific kinds of things they like. I think it's going to be similar in the policy world. You're seeing a disaggregation. It used to be if you wanted to find out what was in a magazine or a newspaper, you'd read the magazine or newspaper and you'd kind of get a sense of its whole corporate institutional identity. Now, people follow individual writers on different platforms. They don't really pay as much attention to the platform itself and its aggregation of writers. I think the same thing's happening in politics. You're not going to have necessarily these same kind of overarching grand ideologies that you had until very recently. Instead, it's going to become more idiosyncratic, individualized mixes of different issues and how they fit together.
So I think that answers a bit of the question about institutions, because in the old days, you had to rely on National Review. I mean, when I was a high school student in the late 80s and a college student in the early 90s, I subscribed to National Review because that's where I was going to find out what was really going on in the world. And the fact is that there have been some great things published in National Review. I don't dismiss the whole publication, but the point is that today there really is no one center of opinion molding that is absolutely dominant on the right, because as you say, everybody can put out his shingle and with his sign on it and attract readers and listeners just like that because of this radically decentralized world. So it's because remember in the old days, you probably remember the John Randolph Club, which was the idea of it was that this would be a series of meetings between libertarians who were happy the Cold War was over and were hoping that there were some conservatives who wanted to just now bring the troops home and be a normal country again. And then you had the paleo-cons who were all too happy to bring the troops home and who had domestic concerns that the neocons just didn't care about. And so the two of those groups banded together. But the idea was that this would be like a quote unquote alliance, like we'll all write for Chronicles magazine and you'll all come speak at our economics conference. But that doesn't matter anymore. It's not there's no one magazine these days that matters so much that we need to build alliances around it. So in this day and age, then, if you're on the right, you don't even necessarily go to Fox News. Fox News has more viewership than CNN or MSNBC, but it's still dramatically down from its peak. So if somebody says to you, Dan McCarthy, I'm a conservative and I'd like to consistently read sources that are going to describe the world for me the way I see it, where do you send them? Well, okay, ISI, obviously, but where else?
Well, the same sources basically that other people are looking at. So, Twitter is certainly the best place to go, or X as it now is. It's the best place to go to find a kind of wide range of opinion and to, kind of individually seek out interesting voices. During the election season, it was, I'd always drop by Real Clear Polling and Real Clear Politics, which are still the best aggregators of polling and the best aggregators of opinion pieces. And there is still, I'm old fashioned enough that I still do look at, magazines and newspapers even. But I realize that, it's, I think it's hard because when you and I, for most, for people who are younger than about 40 in this country, it used to be there were these things called bookstores, and there were magazine racks and newsstands, even in places that weren't bookstores. And you could just browse and you would see something and say, oh, I'd be kind of interested. Maybe I want to find out what the left-wing neocons, the New Republic people are saying. I'm going to pick up a copy as a New Republic and read that. And maybe you'd find, in the reviews section, there might be a reviewer who is a good literary writer, or you might find, someone who is just so cantankerous and idiosyncratic, they were interesting, in the front of the book. And, you kind of got a sense of the map of the world from that. It's both an advantage and a disadvantage today that you don't get on the one hand, that kind of omnibus packaging. You don't get that chance to explore kind of serendipitously what, an editor has curated for you. On the other hand, you can kind of go off in any direction you want, which means that you can specialize a little too much sometimes. And I do see young people who, get onto X or get onto other social media and kind of think they're the first person ever to discover some of these ideas that, for example, Brent Bozell had, 60, 70 years ago, or any number of other issues where, any number of other trends where it turns out someone else has been playing those chords on your guitar before you started strumming them. But, every generation is going to discover these things for itself. So in some ways, I almost want to take a step back and just say, you know what, I'm not, I can tell you the best thing to do to learn older stuff, but I can't necessarily tell you what the best thing to do is to navigate the new media environment.
Hey, everybody, if you're like me, you look at your health insurance policy and sometimes you just wonder, what am I even paying for here? American health insurance is an absolute mess. That's no secret. It's expensive and frustrating, and it's not getting any better. It's not going to be better next year or the year after that. Well, finally, there's something you can do about it, because this whole mess is why Crowd Health was created in the first place. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for health care through crowdfunding. So for $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more. And you don't have to worry about doctors' networks either. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use code WOODS. Crowd Health is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, and remember code WOODS. Now, I can think of ways that conservative institutions have influenced politicians, but I do think that Trump and Vance are influencing conservatives and their institutions and the way they think in this sense that Trump, I think, is just a common sense kind of guy. I mean, he's non-ideological, I think, in general. J.D. Vance is, I think, much more well-read, much sharper. He has a much clearer idea of where he stands, but he too is going to be unsatisfying to ideologues because, on the one hand, a J.D. Vance could be perfectly at home in an administration that would say, sometimes we do want to use the power of the state on behalf of things that we believe in. Maybe we want to use it on behalf of causes that we think will help the American family or help moms stay home with their recently born children or whatever. But at the same time, he can be equally at home in the very same administration that also supports Doge and seems to think that there is a dramatic amount of cutting that can be done. So it's hard to pigeonhole somebody like him.
That's right. And I think it's going to be, not just true of J.D. Vance, but true of American politics, going forward for the next, for the foreseeable future. And I think that you're going to see fewer and fewer of these kind of, straight down the line, straight ticket kind of ideologues, right? Not just straight ticket in the basic partisan sense of voting for, all the candidates of one party, but ideologically straight ticket in the sense of, everything I support has to align with a libertarian vision or a neocon vision or some other comprehensive, approach to the world. I think people are going to be much more selective, and they already are. And, some of that is, self-chosen. Some of that is because people, just naturally say, wait a minute, I do agree with libertarianism perhaps on 90% of things, but here's 10% where I don't agree. And rather than being bullied by, ideologues, Murray Rothbard always used to talk about these guys who would, buttonhole you and pigeonhole you and would always, sort of take you aside in a corner at some libertarian gathering and just harangue you until you came around to Gallambosianism or whatever the, particular hang-up or ideology they had was. Instead of, people having to tolerate that, they're finding, in that 10% of the world, because it used to be, if you mostly hung out with social conservatives, or you mostly hung out with libertarians, or you mostly hung out with National Review conservatives, you wouldn't necessarily meet all that many people from the other parts of the movement or parts of the right. Whereas now, online and in other places, it's actually much easier to encounter, so to say, I can spend 90% of my time, hanging out with the budget crunching, guys, and then I can spend 10% of my time hanging out with the family policy guys or someone else. It used to be harder to make that kind of mix, whereas now it's practically easier, and therefore I think it's psychologically easier as well.
I was saying the other day to a guest, I've already forgotten the name, but that it is very, very satisfying, not just in an "I told you so" sense, but really, I'm happy that I live in a world now in which so many opinion molders on the right speak about endless wars and warmongers, and they want to bring the troops home and all this stuff. And because as you well know, I mean, you worked on the Ron Paul campaign, at least one of them, and that was not the mainstream opinion. Nobody spoke that way. If you used language like that, you were immediately pigeonholed as a Ron Paulian. And now to live in a world where that's borderline mainstream is very satisfying, not just because Ron Paul deserves to be vindicated, but also because I'd rather live in that world. I prefer this world very much. But my concern is that these people who now today voice these opinions, I don't think have been quite battle tested just yet. And if we were to have a terrorist attack on our soil, how long would it be before they would be calling for vengeance overseas again? So, I mean, I can't be alone in being a little bit concerned about that.
No, I totally share your concern there. And these are folks, there are two sides to that as well. One is that if you did have another 9/11 or you never had, another kind of terrorist attack, would some of these folks instantly convert into 2003 era George W. Bush, hawks or neocons? Some of them would. The other problem, though, is that some of them are unbattle tested in the other direction, which is they actually are principled and they are going to stick to their guns, but they just don't know how to make the arguments in a way that makes them not sound, fringy or, easily dismissed. And, that's something that movements go through periodically. You have to always, sort of help the new people kind of learn how best to, deploy their arguments. But also the terrain shifts, and that's happening in two ways as well. On the one hand, I think it actually is much easier now to make the kinds of arguments that our friend Scott Horton, for example, makes, which are 100%, sort of very firm, very bold arguments, about imperialism and about, non-interventionism. So, in some ways, the Overton window has shifted. The possibilities are different now. But the other thing, though, is a lot of the foreign policy thought that you and I, put our energies into, mastering and going over, that was predicated on this idea that the United States is the primary power in the world. And, the things we're doing, mostly for ill, are the things that are shaping how the world's turning out. And that there's a lot of blowback, for example, in many of our interventions in the Middle East and elsewhere. I think we're actually going to start entering into worlds. In fact, we already are, especially in the last year or so here, where other countries now really are acting very much independently and fully of their own sort of volition. And so you're going to start getting situations where the old analysis of, okay, here's why the neocons are getting us into this conflict, may not apply in the same way, because now it's going to be, the Israelis are just doing something in their national interest. The Turks are doing something in their national interest. America has a national interest almost always in staying out. And yet, if people say, well, what do you make of the conflict? Who do you think is, more just or less just? It becomes, a much harder question than it was when it was a matter of, the U.S. going into places where we had no business sticking our noses in and starting, getting involved in conflicts that we didn't know how to end. Now it's going to be other people are starting the conflicts. They're going on for, maybe years, maybe decades. And the question becomes, do you get worn down? Do people try to pull you into it? Do you feel as if, you've got to not only stay out of it, but also kind of insulate your own interests, whether it's, your own citizens or travelers or whatever? It's going to be a very different and complicated kind of environment, as we already see right now.
I'm going to throw you a curveball here. We hear a lot of criticism on, in many areas of the right, of so-called identity politics. And people say identity politics is just, it's just awful. It undermines the social fabric. They got all these reasons that it's so bad. But let me play devil's advocate here. What could be more important than who you are? Almost the whole world engages in identity politics. Almost the entire world. It's like it's only white Europeans who say, "Oh, don't think about things like that." After all, we know the verse, "How can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" That is what motivates people. What's so wrong about it?
It's pretty darn shallow is one of the problems. So, identity politics can mean a lot of things because identity is such a capacious term. But, in practice in American politics, when we talk about identity politics, we're talking about, sort of race and ethnicity-based politics. And that's going to have, some pretty strict limits. And already the Democrats have kind of discovered where those limits lie. They've found out that, in fact, their, sort of race and ethnicity-based coalition was not as airtight as they expected it to be. Once you had someone like Donald Trump come along, who instead of constantly apologizing for being white and for being a Republican and for, wanting to close the border and everything else, he actually says, well, you know what? America's a great country. We like our history. We like our people. And that doesn't just mean white people. It means, other people too. But there's nothing wrong with the white people here as long as they're, good, solid Trump supporters. That's Trump's line. And, he'll talk about, closing the border and saying, I love Mexicans. I love our Hispanic citizens, but I'm going to close the border. And why should you be offended by that? Because, who's the first person who's going to lose their job to a new immigrant? It's going to be the last immigrant. So, Trump changed the whole, sort of roadmap there. I'm just skeptical of, I guess I would put it this way. A lot of people, because they oppose identity politics, they adopt what is kind of anti-identity politics. And that's just as bad as identity politics, or if not just as bad, it's a bad thing unto itself that is, that should be repudiated. So anti-identity politics is when you're constantly saying, you know what, it's going to be great to have, demographic change willy-nilly in our country. It's going to be great to have, multiculturalism and, maybe de-Westernizing the West or something like that. That's an idiotic idea that's only going to, that's like any other kind of Jacobinism. You're destroying your own traditions and you don't know what the heck's going to come after them. And chances are it's going to be some kind of disorder that then, some really, powerful and perhaps rather violent force will bring order to. So that is all, terrible. But the flip side of that, which is, we're now going to concentrate on, our most superficial aspects or our purely hereditarian side of things. That's cutting off an awful lot, especially, while the left-wing criticisms of white people, actually, that's maybe the best way of putting it. The left-wing criticisms of white people are all wrong. It's not white people are going out and being imperialistic all the time and no other race was being imperialistic. That's obviously BS. If anything, the opposite is the case, right? White people have this tremendous, tendency to want to destroy their own civilization. They're the only people on this planet who have that kind of suicidal drive. That is, if anything, is characteristically white and characteristically European. Unfortunately, over the last, 200 or so years, that's been it. And that's something that, has to be overcome as opposed to embraced. Just think about, how, when this country was 90% white, you got the beginnings, and in fact, in many cases, more than the beginnings, but really a very fast-tracked approach to a lot of the evils we have today. And they hadn't been developed into what they are now, but already the principles, the philosophical principles were laid at a time when, you would say, on the basis of identity politics, that America should have been, completely, strong and solid and conservative. It wasn't. In fact, already was, trending in the direction where it was going to get us today.
Tom Woods Show listeners, I know you recognize the importance of sound money, and I know a lot of you are interested in Bitcoin. And you may have heard the expression, not your keys, not your coins. So a lot of you have your Bitcoin on an exchange, and I know you need to get it off that exchange, but you don't know how to do it. It seems like something only techies would know. You don't know where to start. Now, with enough time and dedication, anyone can learn to properly take their Bitcoin into self-custody. But stuck on this fiat treadmill, a lot of people just don't have the spare hours at the end of the day to figure it all out. Well, Bitcoin Mentor is a personalized one-on-one education and Bitcoin consultancy service founded by the best in Bitcoin education, BTC Sessions, Mr. Ben Perrin. So whether you're a beginner or a longtime hodler looking to upgrade, and sorry, I cannot say hodler, that just doesn't sound right to me, Bitcoin Mentor can guide you through self-custody, running a node, home mining, multi-sig setup, even inheritance planning. Leaving Bitcoin on an exchange risks losing everything gained to a hack, bankruptcy, or 6102 attack. Their team of mentors will work with you based on your specific needs to get you to the point where you can sleep easy at night knowing your money is secured and in your control. Visit bitcoinmentor.io/woods for special discounted offers for Tom Woods listeners. That's bitcoinmentor.io/woods. Well, that's certainly fair enough. But one could say, it reminds me of an argument that Peter Brimelow made in his book Alien Nation. He pointed out all these different countries around the world that had within their borders groups that differed in either in religion or in ethnicity or whatever. And sometimes they were very small differences, but there were still conflicts within those countries. And people would say, "Oh, but look at these are just very small differences." And you'd say, "But that's my point. Is that sometimes?" So I guess what I'm saying is, it doesn't help. So that yes, you're right. If I look back to 1965, the roots of a lot of what's about to go wrong in society, the seeds of those problems have long since been sown. But then to say, well, now we're gonna have the immigration reforms of 1965, and it can't get any worse because look at how bad it is with all white people. It can get worse in different ways. Maybe the ideas get worse. Maybe the society becomes less cohesive.
Yeah, a few years ago, this is back around 2015 or so, it's actually immediately pre-Trump, you had a Supreme Court, which consisted entirely at that time. I forget, we just had a little bit of change on the court, so we had got to the point where it was basically all Catholic and Jewish. There were no white Protestants on the U.S. Supreme Court for a period of about a year or so. Now, if you had told a, sort of classic so-called nativist back in the, early 20th century, late 19th century, this is what the Supreme Court in the year 2015 is going to look like, that person would have said, that's going to be a nightmare. We're going to have, pure socialism in America, and you're also going to have the imposition of, Catholic doctrine on all the Protestants. It's going to be, the Pope is going to be our leader. Basically, what actually some people on the right today would very much like to see happen. That was, a kind of nightmare scenario. And if you told them you'd have a Catholic majority, and, I forget, it was probably like 5 Catholics, 4 Jewish, but it was very closely divided. If you told, a classic, sort of Anglo-Saxonist of the late 19th century and early 20th century, this is what you'd be in for, they would assume a dystopia. And actually, they would have guessed nothing correctly about what the actual divisions on the court were, and that the court was, in fact, some of the Catholics were not really politically very Catholic at all. Some of the Catholics who were quite Catholic, socially and religiously in terms of the real faith itself, they were politically, not just Anglo-Saxon Protestant in some ways, but even more, sort of rigorously constitutionalist than some of the older sort of Anglo-Saxon jurists. So the actual people on the court did not reflect the nightmare scenarios, even though you could certainly say that, many of these cultural issues were, even there, you think about issues like abortion, and there's a certain part of the identitarian right which would say, oh, abortion, this was foisted on us by the Jews. But actually, white Protestants were some of the most enthusiastic people for abortion, precisely because they liked the idea of eugenics as a curb on Catholic immigration. So the real history is actually very different from, what very shallow ideologues in the 21st century imagine. And, what I learned from that history is that some of the things that we think right now are going to be disasters might actually turn out to be self-correcting or, different. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to preserve something that we're losing. That's not the case. But rather, you're going to have a different mix of virtues and vices in the future than what you've had at the present or in the past. Similarly, in the past, people predicted certain kinds of problems for America, many of which didn't materialize, although some of them did materialize. And this is why, there's an interesting set of letters between Count de Gobineau, who was one of the first, kind of scientific racialists of the 19th century, someone who really wanted to apply Darwinism to the human race. And then he had a correspondence with Alexis de Tocqueville. And Tocqueville would absolutely never go along with Gobineau's suggestions about the importance of race. And Tocqueville kept saying, not only do I not believe this, but I think this is a really, bad area of investigation for you to go down. If you look at Tocqueville's understanding of America in Democracy in America, and you look at some of the things he predicted and feared, I think his predictions and fears turn out to be much more solidly based because they are, sort of grounded in human nature and sociological. Although, Tocqueville certainly looked at these 3 races in America, the whites, the blacks, and the American Indians. And he had, at that time, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans were not really an issue at the time. And he had, some very depressing thoughts about where this was going to wind up. So even Tocqueville, isn't necessarily giving you a very optimistic vision of where America is going in the long run in terms of these ethnicities. But again, when I look at history, I look at, peoples which have had massive, sort of underclass, overclass disparities. And oftentimes, most of the time, perhaps, those are not disparities that are based on race. They really are based on, legal histories. They're based on, social practices. So I'm, more optimistic, perhaps, than people who see an identitarian future. The other thing, too, is that I think there's just going to be too much splintering of identity itself. And already, I think you see a lot of sort of things that identitarians who have a kind of big picture sense of identity would never have predicted in terms of, what particular kinds of mixes of ethnicity or dominant, sort of identities, when you have people of multiple backgrounds. It's very weird. I mean, someone like Geert Wilders, for example, who is, a politician, a European politician who is a very strong opponent of immigration. One of the things that, most people wouldn't know because he makes a point of not highlighting this is I think he's actually like half Indonesian. So a lot of the stories are often more complicated. I shouldn't say always, but often. Now that said, I want to stress again that there's nothing wrong with the kind of cultural and ethnic homogeneity that the Japanese have. If you have that and you want to preserve it, good for you. But, America hasn't been like that for a very long time and really never was. Not because we've always been, a melting pot, but rather because, even when we had a very significant dominant population, ethnically, there were always, plenty of exceptions to that. And now we're in, an era which is getting more fragmentary as opposed to more consolidated.
There's one more thing I wanted to raise with you, and that is an issue that's dividing both Democrats and Republicans and left liberals and conservatives, and that's Israel. And it's dividing these sides more, I think, than ever, because the Republican side, apart from Pat Buchanan, there really were very few people who had much disagreement with Israeli policy. Now, of course, we know about Reagan had his moments of unhappiness with Israeli leadership, and you can find exceptions here and there, but and frankly, the Democratic left, has been more or less on board. It's been mostly people at I hate to use the word fringes, but I suppose if the shoe fits, it has been mostly people on the fringes in the sense that they're not part of the political mainstream who say that the special relationship with Israel has not been beneficial to the United States. And the question really ought to be, is it beneficial to the United States because that's the country we live in? What do you make of this? I'm not going to ask you to predict the future because I don't know that that's helpful, but there are people who agree on so many things, but this one issue is definitely threatening, let's say, political unity on both sides.
I will predict the future to a small extent here. With the Democratic coalition, they, even despite losing a lot of Hispanics and some blacks to Donald Trump, the Democrats are still very much a coalition of a younger and less white America. And a lot of the folks who have come into this country, who have relatively recent immigrant parents, they're not coming from an evangelical Christian background, and they're not converting to evangelical Christianity. So evangelical Christianity has done a surprisingly good job, at least relative to other denominations, in terms of keeping its numbers up. It's not falling the way that a lot of, certainly the mainline Protestants are. But at the same time, I don't think Indian Americans, for example, from subcontinental India, are converting to evangelicalism in large numbers. And in fact, if you look at people of Indian or it's complicated in the case of sort of someone like Tulsi Gabbard, but you can look at any number of folks, whether it's Vivek Ramaswamy or others, who they come from a different ethnic background, and that's true even on the Republican Party. Different cultural background, religious background. If you look at the Democrats, that's much more true. And so I don't know where the Democrats would replenish. Democrats are still getting most of the Jewish vote in America. But even so, a lot of the Jewish vote is now very anti-Israel. So that's a case where, the Jewish vote itself is starting to fragment and split. While, the sort of non-Jewish, non-white elements of the Democratic coalition are probably becoming more and more critical of Israel, and that's probably going to continue more or less indefinitely. Black Americans are maybe an interesting question there because they've often been very critical of Israel and relatively supportive of Palestinians. Things like black Muslims and whatnot. That's often been part of the identity, really. That may change. I just don't know what the future holds there. But otherwise, I think the Democrats are not going to become a more pro-Israel party over the years to come. The Republicans, meanwhile, in a way, as both parties become less wedded to the politics of an era when you had people like Bill Clinton and the Democrats, and then you had the evangelicals and the Republicans, both of whom had very strong Israel commitments. I think the Republicans, have a kind of more leeway now to experiment with where they're going. You see this with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is very pro-Israel indeed, but also, he'll say things that, people in, what used to be called the Israel lobby just don't like hearing. Whether it's about America's relations with, other countries, or whether it's, telling Netanyahu that he's gone, too far on this or that. So I actually think that, in some ways you may see, just as the 2024 election in certain respects depolarized the country with respect to race, or at least, somewhat depolarized Hispanics, you may see a depolarization of Israel coming, where it's still going to be a hot button issue, and there will be intense disputes. But I don't know if it's going to necessarily be one of the things that is as tightly structured as it has been for the last generation. And again, I do think with the Democrats, you're probably going to see an emerging, sort of anti-Israel, or at least distant from Israel kind of position. With the Republicans, it's going to be a mix of strongly pro-Israel, but also people I think who are going to be increasingly outspoken, critical. The other thing too is just that there are issues here that, back in the 1990s, it all came down to whatever America decides about Israel and Palestine is going to be the answer. A lot of people in Israel and in Palestine, people around the world and people in America itself all believe that. Now I think nobody believes that, or at least, very few people who have any common sense believe that. Whatever the future holds for Palestine and Israel and for other nations in the region, that's entirely up to the people in the region. The United States has very little power, to determine what's going to happen there. And so, lobbying America to do one thing or another is perhaps not the most important thing at this point.
I said I wasn't going to make you predict the future. You said that you would. So given your, being a good sport about that, I will put you a little bit on the spot. So Michael Malice has a prediction, and he thinks that because the transgender issue has turned out to be such a loser for the Democrats, and given that they have no honor whatsoever, he thinks it's not impossible that they may start to tiptoe away from that. And you may start seeing articles about, we didn't know puberty blockers could be harmful, and stuff like that. Do you think there's any plausibility to that?
There is. I mean, think about the way that Bill Clinton, for example, tried to triangulate his way away from politicians like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton, certainly. And Bill Clinton tried to represent the Democrats as being tough on crime, as being able to say no to people who said that they were spokesmen for the black the black interest in this country. So in the same way, and even perhaps to a greater degree, because there are so few transgender voters out there, I think the Democrats can completely choose to repudiate that category. Except, and here's where the problem emerges, I think the transgender stuff is not, as someone like Andrew Sullivan would like to believe, an aberration from the sort of sexual radicalism of same-sex marriage and gay rights and the rest of it. I think it's the logical extension of that. And if you start to back away from that, then where do you wind up? So are the Democrats, in rejecting transgenderism, are they now going to say, aha, we actually do know what a woman is, and here's how we're going to define a woman? Because I could see the feminists getting very, very upset about that, not just the transgender activists. And I think across the board, you're going to have, once you start conceding some of these theoretical commitments, which do go to, an absurd length, but once you concede them, where do you stop the concessions? So the Democrats, I think they can't afford to do that. And so even though they will, kind of scapegoat to some degree, perhaps, certain, transgender issues or, individuals, I think that they're actually going to be crafty about this. They're going to publicly back away from that agenda, but they're going to privately continue to normalize these things. I mean, I remember how shocked I was, when you had, this Admiral Rachel Levine character, right, as a health official in the Biden administration. I mean, this person had been a health official, I think, in Pennsylvania right before that, and that was weird enough. I was baffled by that. But Pennsylvania's had some strange times lately. With seeing that, seeing this individual in a national role, that just made me think, wow, the Democrats, not only have the Democrats gone crazy, but America's gone crazy. I don't know what country I live in at this point. I think the Democrats will back off from, I think they're going to try to back off of the, transgender surgeries for children. They're going to try to back off of, some of the more provocative, in-your-face stuff. But they're still going to, behind the scenes, continue to chip away at this. And the other thing, too, is the Democrats, of course, are wedded to the, academic industrial complex. And that academic industrial complex is not changing the least. You're not going to see, gender studies departments start to say, wait a minute, all these ridiculous textbooks on gender studies that we've, been, writing and publishing about and, cramming down students' throats, all this just, we were wrong about all that. You're not going to see any kind of, embarrassment or repudiation. Instead, you'll see a change in publicity strategy, but it's not going to change the substance.
Yeah, boy, if there's one group of people I would not want to be wedded to, it's American academics. because these are the people who they don't have to live with the consequences of their crazy ideas. They just spin their crazy ideas and go to their faculty parties, and that's it. And generally they're coming out with ideas that hurt the most vulnerable people, the most confused people, the poorest people, who, when you introduce crazy ideas, it destroys them. So yeah, I wouldn't want to have to. I'm glad that I can ridicule these people. And I wish I could live in a world where, honestly, Michael Malice will be unhappy with me for this, but I wish I lived in a world where the professors were admirable. Where they really, really were people searching for the truth, come what may, and they were rigorous and insisted on the highest standards. And I know there still are some like that out there, but that's not the impression you get from the general lot of them. And it saddens me. I mean, look, your whole institute, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where does the name of that come from? What was the initial idea behind it?
Yeah, well, Frank Chodorov, who was a great libertarian in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, he'd been a colleague of Albert J. Knox in kind of many anti-statist endeavors. Frank Chodorov wrote a essay, for, I think it was originally for Human Events, the newspaper, and he said it was funny because he was addressing a kind of almost Doge-like situation, or at least a Doge-like mentality, right? There were conservative activists saying, what we have, this is the sort of early 50s, it's the Joe McCarthy era. You've got all these communists in government jobs. The communists are infiltrating America's government, and communism is gaining ground in China, and we're losing, the whole world is perhaps going communist. Where is this? How can we stop this? We've got to get we've got to get the communists out of government jobs. And Chodorov kind of had two smart things to say about that. The first is, don't just get the communists out of the government jobs, get rid of the government jobs.
Yeah.
So that was a very smart sort of Doge approach to it. But the other thing he said was that it's not enough just to, go out there and have all these countermeasures against the communists if you don't actually stand for something stronger in place of communism. And it's got to be, intellectually and morally stronger. And so, Chodorov said, if you want to defeat communism, you can't just, attack it. You can't just complain about it. You actually have to teach the alternative, and that's going to be, the West. That's going to be, what it actually means to be a human being and to flourish, based on your nature. And so Chodorov said, you've got to start. There had been an organization back in the 20s, I think, called the Intercollegiate Society of Socialists. And Chodorov said, this institution did some real damage because it was one of these early, forays into taking over our academy. So even in the 1950s, when Chodorov was writing, he already considered the academy almost a lost cause. And it was because of what, the leftists, the socialists had done a generation before. And he said, if you want to undo that, you're going to have to do kind of what the socialists did, only in the name not of socialism, but of actually defending private property and defending the West. And so he said, you've got to create, something like an intercollegiate society of individualists. Now, a society of individualists was always, a kind of a tall order. And but luckily, Chodorov's idea didn't just appeal to libertarians, it also appealed to traditionalist conservatives who said, he's exactly right about this. We actually do have to reconnect with the Western tradition. We have to reintroduce students to the great books. So from the very beginning, this intercollegiate society of individualists was actually a mix of libertarians and traditionalists. And in fact, some of the more enterprising program officers and people who were out in the field actually starting student chapters were traditionalists more than libertarians. So over the course of 10 or 15 years or so, it becomes clear that the name is a little misleading because, first of all, to the extent there are people on the right who call themselves individualists, they're libertarians, not a wider category of conservatives and libertarians and traditionalists and others. And second, there are also, this being the 1960s by then, an awful lot of people who are calling themselves individualists who are just hedonistic hippies. And even the libertarians don't want to be associated with those people. So, at least the more sober or serious kind of libertarians that, ISI was catering to. So ISI changed its name from Intercollegiate Society of Individualists to Intercollegiate Studies Institute. But the idea was still the same. The idea was that, you have to go and provide resources that are outside of the, the universities, but they're able to get inside of them. So we provided Richard Weaver fellowships, for example. These are sources of financial support to graduate students. And Tom, I believe you're one of our esteemed alumni.
From 1996, yes.
Yes, indeed. So the best and the brightest minds have been Weaver Fellows. And, we have a number of other programs as well, honors programs for students during the summer and all kinds of other things, lecture bureaus and whatnot. And, it's had an effect, actually. And sometimes it looks hopeless and people could say, well, look, obviously you didn't reverse what was happening to the universities in the 1950s. You didn't take back the campuses. But the fact that, things are even not quite as bad as they could be, the fact that there's any survival whatsoever, and that, we actually did create not only a lot of, faculty members and professors, but also independent scholars and, people like Tom Woods. That was, that's a great achievement, I think, for an organization. And ISI, has that to its credit and can continue to boast of that, in the future in the 21st century. And, right now, I think we've got opportunities that didn't exist before. One thing that, I should say is kind of a more optimistic note than the one I had earlier about our colleges and universities. Even these faculty lounges do feel a certain amount of pressure right now. And it's coming from several directions. The state colleges and universities, and here again, it kind of upsets some of the things that libertarians might believe, although it's always been ironic, right? Because libertarians have always kind of made an exception for libertarian economists employed at state universities. That's never been something where, I'm so principled, I couldn't possibly accept taxpayer money to become, a professor at a state institution.
Well, may I just interject in parentheses?
Yeah.
That is precisely the position of our friend Bob Murphy.
Oh, I know. Why Bob is,
But he taught only at Hillsdale, which takes no federal money, and he taught at Texas Tech in a program that was privately funded. So I will just say, whether or not you agree with that, there was Bob, sticking to his principles.
Bob is a libertarian's libertarian, and he has ironclad principles, which other libertarians generally don't. But other libertarians, they would, even as they take these government jobs, they would still say, who needs state universities? They really shouldn't exist. Okay, that's fine as a theoretical point of view. But it's kind of interesting that actually, precisely because these state universities have to be somewhat accountable to elected representatives who in turn are somewhat accountable to voters and to, organized interest, political interests, the state universities now have to actually take account of the fact, wait a minute, a majority of the voters in this country right now are Trump voters. So if we want to continue having state colleges and universities and getting them funded by Republican legislatures, we're going to have to make some changes around here. So right now there are opportunities for conservative intellectuals and, credentialed academics that did not exist before. And we'll see how that turns out. There's plenty of room still for concern that, a lot of the conservative academics, who are, whose ship seems to have come in, they might get corrupted, they might sell out, they might, or they might get turned into kind of, just kind of museum piece or zoo kind of conservatives, right? You keep them in the cage, you keep them well fed, but you don't actually let them have any power in the university. So there is that risk. But nonetheless, the change we've seen just in the last few years is still pretty darn dramatic. And it's not just a change in those state universities, because the other thing you see is, first of all, some of the Ivies do often hire, even now, people who have been undergraduates who go on, they're brought in as graduate students to the Ivies, or even hired perhaps as Ivy League professors. There's still a sense that, and it's definitely something the Ivy League would probably not want to say out loud, but they do these lower institutions as being a farm team. And it still has, some sense of being a feeder or a filter for them. So they start to say, if there are these changes taking place at these institutions, then maybe we need to change a little bit as well. And of course, even though a lot of these institutions feel bulletproof in terms of having very large billionaire donors who are with them, they are, vulnerable to the fact that some of their alumni, billionaire donors, are against political correctness for their own reasons, not always because they're conservatives, but because they've got one axe to grind or another. So a lot of university development departments and alumni, sort of cultivation departments, and university presidents, including private universities, including Ivies, they're starting to say, well, financially, maybe it's not best that we be identified as being the far, far left. Maybe we do actually have to have, some token, at least conservatives, teaching in our classrooms and participating in our university life. And again, what I'd like to see, of course, is that goes beyond tokenism. And I think that's where there's going to have to be, conservatives calling out tokenism and saying there has to be more than this. There has to be real pressure. But there are, sort of shafts of light there. There's a sense of a little bit of reform and self-awareness on the part of university administrators.
Well, I had said, we'll wrap up with this, that if I have to live with federal funding of these institutions, then as a compromise measure, I will offer this as a midway point to where I'd like to be, that institutions getting this funding, particularly like the medical schools, but I suppose not just medical schools, that the campuses have to be observant of academic freedom. And as soon as they treat scholars the way Jay Bhattacharya was treated at Stanford, then the funding gets revoked. And I was saying that kind of in jest. Well, lo and behold, I read the other day that Jay is considering implementing that exact policy at NIH, that if you treat scholars this way, that then the funding goes away. And I just, it couldn't happen to a more deserving bunch, Dan. I mean, these people deserve to be quaking in their boots over this, that yes, they may actually have to allow civilized discussion now.
And the flip side is also true. Someone like Jay Bhattacharya, it is an absolute great justice. It's a sign of cosmic justice, in fact, that Jay Bhattacharya is now going to be in a position where he will be able to make sure that people like him are not trampled on the way that he was. And that's one of the things, there are ups and downs, of course, with any administration, but I'm very hopeful with the Trump administration right now, the Trump-Vance administration, precisely because they're looking at people like Jay Bhattacharya. They really are casting a very wide net, and they're bringing in a lot of people who know from firsthand experience what it's like to have these institutional powers turned against you. And of course, that extends to people like Tulsi Gabbard, being followed by, government agents and in the airports and, generally being scrutinized by her own government. I think right now you've really got a chance for some of these outsiders. And again, it's not that they're ideologically uniform or, exactly what you'd want them to be necessarily, but they're nonetheless people who have all felt what it's like to be on the watch list and what it's like to be, not just an outsider, but an enemy of the government, an enemy of the state. And so hopefully they will actually start to, reform some of these policies, make it much harder for them to be abused the same way they've been abused for the last, couple of decades, ever in the future.
Well, with that, we will wrap up, and I will, unless you have another particular link to recommend to people, I will urge people to check out modernAgeJournal.com, where you can find out, you can read what, occasionally what Dan is writing, but certainly what Dan is himself reading and approving. So you get curated articles by Dan, but also at tomwoods.com/2585, I'll have Dan's Twitter @ToryAnarchist, and we'll have other links there. And also I want to remind everybody that the greatest event of 2025 is only a couple of months away in late February 2025, and that is the Tom Woods Cruise. And I hope you will come join me, leaving Clown World behind for one glorious week with Scott Horton and other favorite guests of the Tom Woods Show. The website is tomwoodscruise.com. Dan, thanks so much for your time, as always.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.